Hello, I'm Joel McLeod.
And I'm Roland Tanner.
This is the 905er. This marks our 20th episode of the 905er. It is also the week of Remembrance Day. And as such, we are straying somewhat from the beaten path for this week's episodes. As many of you are aware, Roland and I are pretty outspoken about a number of issues. Wherever you lie on the political spectrum, you have to agree the fact that we are able to have these discussions at all are owed to previous generations. We owe a lot to the men and women and the civilians who gave up their lives in defense of the freedoms that we enjoy today. In that spirit, we wanted to focus this week's episodes on two institutions headquartered here in the 905 region, whose missions are to preserve, protect, and promote Canada's history and the veterans' stories of the First and Second World Wars. Today, we speak with Dave Rohr, CEO of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton, Ontario, about their role in preserving this legacy, the challenges they are facing due to COVID-19, and what we can do to help them keep going. Thursday's episode, we will speak with Alex Black of the Juno Beach Centre, headquartered in Burlington. Please have a listen. I'd like to thank Dave Rohr, who is the CEO of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum, situated in Hamilton, Ontario. Dave, thank you for coming on the 905er.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today, Joel, and Roland. I'm glad to chat with you.
Great. You know what? Why don't we just talk about the vision that the Warplane Museum has in terms of maintaining Canada's legacy of the First and Second World Wars, the Korean Wars, and our peacekeeping, as well as our most recent endeavors in Afghanistan, and just how you picture the Warplane's mission in relation to all of that.
Well, you know, I've been involved at the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum for 21 years now. I started as a volunteer chief pilot and then became CEO and president in 2005. And it's been an honor to be associated with this museum. And I've told the staff, and we have a small staff, a full-time staff of about 22. We're not funded by the government. We're a stand on our own 2 feet type of a business, which is actually a blessing to us, particularly given this year's challenges. That we've learned the business acumen of running a museum, because what my assessment is after 21 years that the museum business, unless funded by governments or large corporations or mainline sponsors, is not a viable business in and of itself in terms of paying all the bills, particularly when you're Canada's flying museum and you have all the overhead and the capital expenses of aircraft and then the operation expenses and the maintenance expenses and all those things that are added to flying vintage airplanes. But I tell our staff, and I have told them on a consistent basis, that every day at the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum is Remembrance Day. That's what we're about. That's, lest we forget, to tell the story of the duty, the service, and the sacrifice of all those who have served our country, fallen in the service to our country with the supreme sacrifice, and all those who are currently serving our country and preserving our way of life and our values and our ethics and our freedoms. And so it's a very special mission for us. And to be able to showcase, airplanes that have been flown by Canadians, whether by the Royal Canadian Navy or in the Royal Canadian Air Force or even in Allied services, is very important to us. And it's one of those things that, nobody works at a museum for the money. They work there because there is a love and there's a genuine interest in preserving that history. And I think it's even more important as time goes on, because, I was out this morning briefly, and I was disappointed, to be honest with you, how many people are not wearing a poppy. It's important that we pass that message on to new and young Canadians alike, as well as maybe some older Canadians that have forgotten the importance of it, that we need to remember that sacrifice. In Bomber Command, of course, we're honored to have the only and the last flying Canadian-built Lancaster. And we're honored as a country to have been the only country outside the UK to build Lancasters. 7,377 were built. Half didn't survive the war. 430 were built in Canada of a contract of 500 when the war ended in Europe on May 8th, 1945. And to be able to have the last flying Canadian-built Lancaster, one of 2 left in the world flying, is such an honor to remember all those men and women that built Lancasters at Victory Aircraft at the site of Pearson Airport, as well as all those Canadians that went to Bomber Command and flew in the service with the Allies in World War II. And, we lost 168 people in Afghanistan, if you put it in context with civil servants and perhaps some contractors, and in 14 years. In Bomber Command alone, of the 120,000 plus that served, the Allies made up 1/3 of that group. 55,573 didn't come home. That's not to count the ones that were shot down and taken prisoner of war or injured. Those are the ones that didn't survive their 30 operational missions, didn't come home. And 10,695 of those were young Canadians in the prime of their life. And that's just one segment of that effort. And so that's what that airplane means to me, is to showcase and to remember. And on Wednesday next week, when we fly over the Golden Horseshoe, I hope people, when they see that airplane, will realize what it means. And, when we took the airplane over to England in 2014 to fly with the only other flying Lancaster owned by the Royal Air Force and Battle of Britain Memorial Flight at RAF Coningsby. After we did all our checkouts and we were authorized to fly formation for the 7 weeks and 65 events we did with the Royal Air Force, we were in bomber country, and which is what it was called, where all the bombers were located in World War II. And we went to a pub, the Bluebell Pub, and it was a building that's 1,200 years old, and 700 years has been a pub. And Lancaster crews' names were on the ceiling, and in the beams that were on the ceiling, there were coins in the beams. And after a pint or two, we asked the bartender what were the significance of those coins. And what it was that if you were a crewman in Bomber Command and you had a mission, and then you came home, in the middle of the morning, the middle of the night, and you debriefed your mission, and then you went and had breakfast, and maybe had a rest, and you might not be going out that night. You might get up in the late afternoon, and you'd go to the pub for a pint. And when you bought your pint, you'd get your change. And the crews, what they would do is stick the change in the coin in the beams, so that when they came back the next night or the next night after that, they'd have money in the bar. And those coins, the owners of those coins never came back. And it just really was a poignant moment for us to remember just what it was all about. So our role, is we embrace our mission as a privilege and an honor to be part of it, and it is.
You're talking about flying the Lancaster and the pointing scene. I was just talking with Roland before the interview started. Roland and I live in Burlington, so we quite frequently hear the Lancaster flying overhead. And I was sharing a story with Roland about, I was outside with my dad. This is last year before the pandemic. I was outside with my dad, and we were just chatting, and we could hear the sound in the distance. And I said, "Oh, it's the Lancaster." Okay. You look up in the air and you see the Lancaster fly overhead. And I said to my dad afterwards, I said, "My God, that was loud." It was just this loud, powerful engine. And I was like, "Wow, that's so cool. Why not?" And wait a second, it clicked in my head. I said, what if I was on the ground in Germany in the Second World War and I heard that sound coming overhead multiplied by hundreds? And I thought that would be terrifying to me. If I was just a regular civilian, terrifying, because I know that sound is coming and it's dropping death and destruction on me and my home. And then you flip that around, you say, well, what if you're a civilian in London during the Blitz and you heard the Luftwaffe coming as well? It was one of those things that it really is a powerful noise. And if you just take that moment and transport yourself 80 years ago into somebody's shoes on the ground in London or in Hamburg, Germany, or wherever, you get a sense of just the terrifying nature of war. I mean, maybe I'm being a bit poetic here, but I do think it's a very apt monument to the memory of what that experience was like, both for the soldier as well as for the civilian on the ground.
You're absolutely right, Joel. And I think it's a very important distinction in what we do, to remember that no one wants to glorify armed conflict or war. It's really the failure of humankind to avoid that type of settlement of differences. And you hope that we will reach a state at some point in time where we don't have to be engaged in armed conflict. So our role, it's important that we send the right message, because we don't want to glorify that failure of humankind. But what we do want to do is we want to remember the service and the duty and the sacrifice, because whether it was you or I or our sons or daughters, that generation in the prime of their lives were asked by their country to go into service and to go into harm's way, and they did their job. And it was in a conflict that none of them had any making in or creation of, but they took their role on and they did their job, and at a very high price, obviously. And it's that heritage that's so important to us, because God help us that we're not called into it again. But as the history of the world has taught us, whether it's World War I, which was to be the war to end all wars, and then of course in 1939, here we are 20 years later in World War II, Korean conflict in 1950, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and of course, some of the peacekeeping missions in Africa that were, traumatic. So, I mean, obviously, we've got to do better as a human race, hopefully, to grow and learn. But in the meantime, we can't let that heritage. We can't forget that heritage, because it has been said that those who do not know history are condemned to repeat it, and I spoke about that last year at Remembrance Day, as a matter of fact. And so for new Canadians, for young Canadians, and for my generation, who, although I served in the Royal Canadian Air Force, I never was in conflict. I was never in armed conflict, and I'm thankful that that was the case. But there are a number of my age, even the Canadians my age, and we need to remember. And what did that greatest generation do when they came back from World War II? They came back. They didn't talk about it. There was no such thing as PTSD. There was no treatment really for them. Many of them came back, whether they were wounded physically, they were wounded from being subjected to that the dehumanization of war, and yet they came back and they raised families, they built a country, and prevailed in the 50s and 60s to the country we have today. So it's that we need to remember, and we should remember that, I've always, and this is a bit controversial, but I've always thought that if the politician who declared war had to send his children first, that maybe there would be a second sober thought. And of course, I did wearing the uniform. The last person that wants conflict, armed conflict, are those who are serving our country.
It's an interesting lesson. I know, noticed this in recent history as well, with people like Colin Powell just springs to mind. The people who've been involved in conflicts are some of the most reluctant to do anything that might create another one. I mean, if you think even of people like Neville Chamberlain in Britain, who wanted to avoid a war at all costs, well, that's probably because he'd lived through the horrors of the previous one. And it's very noticeable, I always find, how veterans of conflicts understand it in a way that the rest of us don't.
Yeah.
And I think that tells you so much about the horrors of war. And I was just going to mention about when you said about the sacrifice of people who joined any of the services, but particularly the Air Force, that just the rates at which planes were shot down and that young men were killed, it's just astonishing by modern standards. If we had a war with those kind of rates today, it would be, it's almost unthinkable. I don't know if you could speak a little to that.
Well, that's very true. And what I did want to mention too was, especially the sound of the Merlin engines on the Lancaster, which was probably the state-of-art technology. I mean, it was prior to the B-29 and the payload the B-29 had. It was the largest conventional payload that a bomber had in the Allies, and it made a difference in the war. And the reason, if you were sitting in Britain in June of 1940, when the Blitzkrieg in France fell quickly, or 1942, when you had the evacuation of the British Army by every small vessel that was available, you didn't have a lot to be hopeful of. and with the threat of invasion, just on the other side of the English Channel, or if you were in the occupied lands up to that time, you didn't have much to base a hope on that you would prevail in the struggle, except that Bomber Command was the one element that was every night taking the fight to the enemy, and at least causing the Third Reich to defend themselves rather than to build offensive weapons, so that their artillery pieces had to become anti-aircraft weapons, and their fighters had to become night fighters to defend the fatherland. And that made a big difference in the outcome of the war. So the Lancaster contributed. And when you had 500 or 600 Lancasters and Halifaxes joining in a major assault into the fatherland, they said that the earth actually shook as that group of 700-800 airplanes, could be 10 miles wide, 30 miles long, took off in the early evening, and then straggled home, after 1 or 2 in the morning. But it made a huge. It gave those in the occupied lands, and it gave those who lived in the UK, gave them hope that they would prevail. And of course, under the leadership of Winston Churchill, they did have hope, and of course they did prevail. And so when you hear that airplane fly over now, and you hear the noise of one, I can only imagine what the noise was of hundreds. But I do remember in 2014 when we flew to the UK and we did our first air show at Eastbourne on the 14th of August 2014, and we had the 2 Lancasters, which are the last 2 flying in the world. First time a formation of Lancasters had occurred in 50 years with 2 Spitfires. That there was 450,000 people on the beach, and they were just applauding. And the sound, it was music. The Merlins were music because it meant so much to them and their freedom. But the sacrifice was enormous, absolutely enormous. And as I say, 55,573 just in Bomber Command didn't survive. 7,377 Lancasters built, half didn't survive the war. The average mission of a Lancaster, the average life of a Lancaster, was about 7 missions, and of course the crew had to do 30 ops to complete the tour. So the cost was enormous, and it did. It played such a vital role in the morale and giving them hope, and of course the Battle of Britain and the fighters. Churchill said the fighters certainly were essential, and so much was owed to so few by so many. But he also said that our salvation is the bombers, and it really was. And you can imagine the terror of being in downtown London when a V1 or V2 rocket or a Henkel bomber, and of course, it's interesting how the bombing of London, and I knew one of our members who has since passed. Was a young man in the dockyards of London. His family lived near the dockyards, and the dockyards were bombed when a Henkel bomber got lost. And Hitler actually had a prohibition against bombing population centers, believe it or not. And this Henkel got lost and bombed the dockyards. And this gentleman lost his entire family except for one brother. Ended up in a hospital for 4.5 months. When he came out of the hospital, there was no home, there was no family. And he joined the RAF and eventually came to Canada after the war. But that was what, and then, of course, Churchill and Bomber Harris retaliated after that. But it was an accident that led to that destruction. And those are the fragilities in armed conflict, because those are the unknowns that can happen. But it was a terrible time. I'm sure those 6 years were absolutely terrible in Europe, and all because one crazed organization came to power, and maybe in the seeds of the Treaty of Versailles, led to the World War II. But Canada, a young country of 9 million people, part of the Commonwealth. When we went into that war, by the end of the war, we had the third largest air force and the 4th largest navy for a country of 9 million people. We punched so far above our weight.
I know some of the most famous squadrons during the Battle of Britain. I mean, it was Douglas Bader's a famous pilot who lost his legs and was still managed to be one of the most well-known and characterful pilots of the Second World War. His squadron was of Canadians, and I grew up reading the various biographies of him and how he kind of pulled that group of men together who actually was struggling, I believe, when he first sort of came to that squadron, because they'd been through such terrible kind of hardships that they really weren't particularly enthusiastic about suddenly having a squadron leader who they thought could fly. But it's really astonishing. There's a fantastic website. I don't know if you've seen it. I think it's called bombsite.org. And it plots every bomb dropped on London during the Blitz. And when you look at it, you can't put a pin between the bombs. I was saying to Joel before we came on, my mother grew up in London during the Blitz. She lived far enough in North London that she wasn't evacuated. But a bomb fell on their neighbour's house, but it blew their house to pieces. And you can see that on the map, and boy, that brings it home to you. And it's a story I kind of grew up with hearing about, the day the bomb fell on the house kind of thing. And they had to go and live with parents for a year while the house was rebuilt and all this kind of stuff. But to actually kind of see it there, see the evidence of that story that I've heard kind of passed down as a child really makes an impact.
Absolutely. The hardest part of, one of the hardest parts of my 21 years at the museum has been that 21 years ago, we had so many of the actual veterans of that generation and of that conflict that were active members with us, perhaps, in their 60s at that time. And we've lost so many of them. In 2006, we were able to take 4 Lancaster veterans and take them to Oshkosh. Of course, the largest air show in North America every third week or last week of July every year in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And they'd never been to Oshkosh. And so we took them in the Lank. And at that time, they were all in their probably early 80s. And many of them had never talked about their service or anything. And on the Saturday, we were going to have a large gathering called Warbirds in Review. And they were all to bring a story or an artifact or something from one of their missions. And we were going to have reenactors, and the Lank was going to be there, and we had about 3,000 people around them, and they all brought a story or a mission about one of their missions, and we affectionately called them the kids, and so we rented a house for them, and I was kind of overseeing them, and I'd pick them up every morning, and of course for us it was a working trip because we were doing tours through the Lancaster, and we had a retail store, so it was very much a business enterprise for us as well. And they were, they would not, if we were open at 8 o'clock, they wanted to be there. If we were not going to dinner until 7 o'clock, they stayed till 7 o'clock. There was no way they were going to get any special treatment or allow themselves to be treated specially. But what was really interesting was that to observe them, of course we'd say, have the kids been fed? Have the kids been, and I took them all around. But what was really interesting was their cadence picked up. They probably lost 20 years in their walk. They were faster. They were engaged. They were enthusiastic. And in many cases, I would have loved to have been a little bird in their house, because I'm sure that they talked about things they hadn't talked about in years. But they all talked about a different part of the war. And whether it was one fellow who did, Chris Parr, who did 58 missions starting in Hamptons, finishing in Lancasters, and the difference between a mission in 1941 in Hamptons versus a mission in 1944 with Lancasters, or whether it was Dennis from St. Catharines, a Canadian, who on his 15th mission, of course, it was a bad omen if the airplane you flew wasn't serviceable or went U.S. on taxi, which happened to them. And so they had to wait for a backup airplane. They're 45 minutes behind the main packet going into into Berlin. And it's like going in there after you've already hit the bee's nest and every bee is alive. And then they had to fly in. And then as they get to 15,000 feet and they're trying to climb to 25, the second stage supercharger fails and they have to stay low. So they're going in after the main strike, at a lower altitude where all the odds are against them of ever getting home, and yet they did. And they talked about that, or whether it was just different stories, different events. But what was interesting was that one Eric Grove, who was on his fifth mission in Lancaster, in over Berlin, and got hit by night fighters, and of course the night fighters were trying what they would do sometimes is try to hit your arm limit and explode your arm limit in your airplane, and so he lost two of his crew on the run-in that way, and he eventually called a bailout over the target area, and those that did bail out and survive were taken prisoner of war and eventually exchanged at the end of the war. But here he was now in 2006, still questioning his decision to call a bailout or whether he could have maybe nursed the airplane home. I don't think there was any way he could ever nurse the airplane home, but it was still something did he make the right decision as captain of the airplane? And so to see that interpersonal struggle, it was fascinating. They went through a lot, and it's that kind of thing. That's the human side. You see in conflict, you see the numbers, you see the losses, you see the strategies, and the successful campaigns and the failed campaigns. But it's the human side of armed conflict that is the costly side. And so it was just an honor to be able to. First of all, they had some fun because they'd never been to Oshkosh before, and when we came back, they wrote an article. The kids go to Oshkosh, and of course they're all gone. They're all gone now. So that's the hard part about our business is to know these gentlemen and these ladies and gentlemen, and then obviously to have to say goodbye to them.
Because you mentioned about the veteran stories, and I think that really is what the museum is about. It's about preserving these accounts and the history of those who did the heavy lifting of our wars. I myself, I'm a father to two young kids, and making sure that they're aware of this legacy and to have that appreciation of Canada as it is today is important to me. And I'm wondering if maybe you can touch upon what the museum's ideas are to preserve these stories, especially because the veterans are dying, they're passing on. We're just reaching a point where those firsthand accounts are no longer able to be told. And I think we can all agree it's very important for the younger generation, the generations to come, to be able to access those stories. And I'm wondering, maybe just tell us and our listeners what the Warplane Museum is doing to kind of keep that history alive for generations to come.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Joel. And the COVID-19 pandemic, as challenging as it has been, and it has been because our gross loss in revenues are approaching $3 million on a $5 million budget. So it's had a big impact, but the net loss, thankfully, has been a lot less than that, and we will survive and we will get through this. And in comparison to what the generations we're talking about went through, this is nothing, But so put it in context, but there has been silver linings in our challenges, and one of them is, and we've been talking about this for quite a while actually, because there is a sunset clause on these airplanes. There will be a time when they won't be able to fly. Whether it's the fact that you can't get avgas anymore, you can't run a Merlin engine on an environmentally friendly alternate fuel. That could be it, or whether it's fatigue in airframes, lack of parts. How do we keep that heritage alive? How do we teach young and new Canadians that? And the virtual experience, of course, is where these young people are now. I mean, they're into virtual reality. They spend a good part of their life in virtual reality. And so what we've done is we've made a number of strides. Our education department, where we used to have museums within an hour and a half of Hamilton come from September to June to the museum on Monday to Friday. We might have 4 or 5 grade 6 classes, a couple of grade 10 classes, and we would spend the day and teach them. And now we've gone virtual. And now anywhere in the world can plug into a live session at the museum where we teach and we and it could be a live question and answer period with people at the museum, with the education department, or we've gone virtual in terms of putting our programs out online. The other thing we're doing now is we're working in a virtual. There are many of your children and my children are never going to fly a Lancaster, never going to go for a ride in a Lancaster or a B-25 or a PBY or any of our airplanes, but virtually they can. Virtually they can experience everything. And so that we're really starting to realize that our future, and I'm talking long range future, is in the virtual reality realm, and that we can tell the stories. They can actually even do interviews with veterans in a virtual setting, veterans that are no longer with us, but whose stories have been captured, and personas have been captured, and so. We're doing a lot of work in that area. We realize that is the future of the museum down the road, and maybe 2035 and beyond. That may be what it is, But the material, the stories, the personal stories, and the artifacts and the hardware and the airplanes will not be lost. The stories about them will not be lost, or the people that flew them. So that's a silver lining in the COVID-19 pandemic, because although we had that on our radar screen, it's all been pushed ahead now.
You mentioned that it's marvelous to hear those things, and you are confident you can come through this crisis. But is there anything that our listeners, can do to help the museum at this time, to help you get through this?
Roland, that's a great question. Well, let me put it this way. If there's anybody out there listening to this podcast who has heard our airplanes, seen our museum, visited our museum, and ever thought of helping us, this is the year to help us for sure. If you come to our gift store. We are open Wednesday to Sunday, 10 to 4. We have a wonderful collection of items in our gift store. We're online as well. You can buy things online. We have a wonderful 2021 calendar that we just finished. It's called Lancaster and Friends, and it's pictures of the Lancaster with many of the airplanes it's flown with, from B-17s to B-29 to fighters, Spitfires, Hurricanes to Mosquito. It's just a wonderful. It's a wonderful calendar, and you can buy that online. Of course, to all our members, we've already sent it out with an appeal letter. So if you've ever thought of helping us, and for various reasons hadn't done it yet, boy, this is the year to do it. We could really. So thank you for that question. And this Remembrance Day, we're going to fly over the Golden Horseshoe. We're going to do Hamilton and Burlington. We're going to do Brantford. We're going to do Caledonia, and Hagersville, and Jarvis, and Dunnville, and Cayuga, Niagara Falls, obviously Stony Creek, and points towards St. Catharines. And we're going to do it proudly, because this year normally we would have 2,500 to 3,000 people at a live Remembrance Day ceremony, and this year that's not possible. So we're going to do a virtual ceremony on CHCH at 10:30 to 11:30, which has been recorded already. But the actual Lancaster will fly. So pray for good weather for next Wednesday, and if you look, if you're in Burlington and you look up and you see us, if you're kind enough to think about us and drop us a note and maybe a little bit of support, that would be greatly, greatly appreciated.
Well, I think that's where we're going to end the interview for today. But I want to thank you, Dave, for coming on and sharing those stories and the great work that you guys are doing over at the museum. We hope that our listeners do find a way to contribute.
And as I say, it's an honor for us all at the museum to be part of preserving this rich Canadian aviation legacy and heritage.
Absolutely.
And lest we forget.
Thank you. That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
You looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.